Good day. Today is Monday, 28th July 2025, and I'm going to start this program by, again, a very brief overview of the military situation in Ukraine, specifically, again, focusing on what is happening in the Pokrovsk area. Now, Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the regional government of the Donetsk People's Republic, obviously Russian-backed government of the Donetsk People's Republic, he's now given an interview to Russia 24 television in Russia, in which he has basically said that fighting is indeed now underway in Mirnograd, the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk. According to incoming information, already the first armed clashes have taken place on the outskirts of Dimitrov. Dimitrov is the Russian name for Mirnograd, just to make that clear. The Ukrainian battle group has found itself in a very difficult situation in that frontline area. This is again what Pushilin is saying. And he also says that elsewhere, further to the east, in the Krasny Liman direction, he means, of course, Liman, we see liberated settlements and we see the improvement of positions and the advance. But anyway, I take these words to sort of confirm earlier Russian reports that the Russians have indeed broken into Mirnograd itself and that fighting is now already underway there. There's also, as I discussed in my program yesterday and the day before, fighting underway in southwest Pokrovsk. It's not entirely clear what territory the Russians control inside Pokrovsk. Yesterday, Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, again said that the Russians are approaching the junction of the main road, the E50 road from Dnipro, the road through which the supplies are being sent, that they've approached the junction of that road inside the metropolitan area of Pokrovsk, and it repeated again its earlier claim that the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, who are disorganized and short of men, have been obliged to withdraw deeper into the town. Redovka also said that the Ukrainian defenders are trying to repeat the earlier defense strategy that they adopted in Toetsk, a town not far away from Pokrovsk, which the Russians captured some months ago. Anyway, the Ukrainians there again found themselves short of men when the Russians attacked Toetsk in May last year. They withdrew deeper into the town. They tried to convert the high-rise buildings at the center of the town and some industrial plants and factory spaces inside Toetsk, and also coal mines, by the way, into major fortified positions. And of course, they did manage to slow the Russian advance in Toetsk, so that the Russian attack on Toetsk began in May 2024. It was not until, from memory, February 2025 that the Russians fully consolidated or claimed to have captured Toetsk, and the Ukrainians were still able to launch counterattacks towards Toetsk, and fighting in that town it continued, or in and around that town continued for some weeks after. So this, according to Redovka, is the strategy that the Ukrainians are trying to adopt in Pokrovsk now. The difficulty is, the main difference between Pokrovsk and Toetsk is that, as I discussed in yesterday's program, Toetsk is part of a dense cluster of large urban settlements. So Constantinovka is not far away, Kramatorsk is not far away, Chasiv Yar is not far away either. The Ukrainians control various villages and settlements between all of these various places. These settlements, together with the larger towns, make a dense urban sprawl. It was difficult for the Russians to advance through it, and there was never any point in time in the battle for Toretsk where supplies to the Ukrainian garrison fighting in Toretsk was completely cut off. Pokrovsk is different. It is located at some distance from all other big settlements. That is one reason, by the way, why it has become an important road and railway hub. But it is basically isolated in the steppes. The result is that the Russians can encircle it, and in fact, in the process of doing so, one might devise a defense strategy consisting of turning the town into various self-contained fortresses, if you like, based on high-rise buildings. But if you can't get supplies through, then the men who are fighting in Pokrovsk are not going to be able to fight on for very long, because they will run out of supplies and reinforcements, and no army can continue fighting without supplies. Compare this again with Chasiv Yar. The Russians have never been able to cut off communications to the Ukrainian forces that have been trying to defend Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians, as a result, still hold a few buildings in the Yuzhny micro-district. The Russians have never been able to cut off Ukrainian communications and supply routes to Volchansk in the north. And again, that's what's played a big role in enabling the Ukrainians to hold back the Russians in Volchansk as well. But Pokrovsk, as I have said, is different. As a number of commentators are pointing out, Pokrovsk much more closely resembles Selidovo and Kurakhovo further to the south. Isolated towns, isolated in the steppe lands. There are no big adjoining cities or urban communities close by, and that makes it much more difficult to defend these places and much easier for the Russians to surround them and to cut off the supplies to them. Anyway, that's the situation, as far as I can tell, in Pokrovsk at the moment. Now, some Russian channels are now reporting some interesting developments. They're saying that the Ukrainians are redeploying forces to the Pokrovsk area from Zaporoia region, where, by the way, the Russians are also advancing and are pulling in some of their remaining reserves to the front lines, but that they are mostly concentrating around the town of Dobropilia to the north of Pokrovsk. Now, there's been some speculation that these Ukrainian troops are being assembled there in order to prepare for a counterattack in Pokrovsk itself. But some reports, some commentaries that have been appearing on Russian channels today say that this is not the case, that these forces are not strong enough to launch a counterattack in Pokrovsk. They are being hurried to Dobropilia and these other places in order to establish a new defense line. And in recent programs, I have in fact discussed the fact that there have been reports for some time now that the Ukrainians are trying to create some kind of defense line west of Pokrovsk, north and west of Pokrovsk, and also of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. In other words, that the Ukrainians are now starting to see the prospect of loss of these towns, but they are trying to create a new defense line to the west of them. Now, as to that, there's a number of things to say. Firstly, these are reports. They are not by any means corroboration that such a plan to create a defense line exists, though I happen to think that it is very likely. Secondly, I very much doubt that the Ukrainians are going to be able to create a strong defense line on the open steppe, which is not anchored in big urban communities such as the ones we have seen in Donbass. Of course, the Russians did create a dense defense line in 2022, 2023 in Zaporoia and Kherson region. This was the so-called Surovikin line, the defense line with massive minefields, complex trenches, an intricate system of bunkers, dragon's teeth, tank traps, whatever. It was a major Russian operation conducted over the course of the autumn and winter of 2022, 2023, and which, by the way, was continued well into the spring of 2023. Its purpose was, of course, to contain and repel the Ukrainian counteroffensive that everybody knew the Ukrainians and the Western powers were preparing for the summer of 2023. That enormous defense line proved effective. The Ukrainians were unable to break through it. But I very much doubt, I'm deeply skeptical that the Ukrainians can create anything on that scale. I strongly doubt that they have the resources to do it. Zelensky himself, by the way, has just said that Ukraine is going to run a budget deficit of 65 billion euros next year, that it needs money from the European Union basically to cover that budget deficit. I believe that this is separate from the $60 billion that the new Ukrainian defense minister, Mr. Shmyhal, is requesting to keep the Ukrainian military in shape, or at least in a position that it can continue to resist the Russians. Well, maybe Zelensky and Shmyhal will get the money that they're asking for. Maybe not. But one way or the other, a country that has to go cap in hand to the nations of Europe to try to put money together to keep just its running costs covered is not going to have resources, in my opinion, to build anything as complex or as sophisticated or as strong as the Surovikin line, which the Russians constructed in 2023. Besides, even if the Ukrainians can create or recreate something of that nature, that again begs lots of further questions. Does the Ukrainian army now have the resources to hold a line like that? And besides, my own sense is that the Russian military today is far more powerful than the Ukrainian military was in 2023, when basically it failed to break through the Surovikin line or even dent it. The Russians, by way of example, not only have drone swarms on a scale that Ukraine absolutely did not have in 2023, and clear superiority in manpower, armor, and artillery. But of course, the Russian Air Force is very active. As I discussed in my program yesterday, it is now heavily bombing Pokrovsk. There are reports of new precision-guided bombs rolling off the Russian production lines. There's further reports that, contrary to that article by fighter bomber that I discussed some months ago and which was picked up by David Axe in Forbes, the accuracy of these Russian precision-guided FAB bombs has actually been increasing, not reducing, over the last few months. It's widely agreed that bombs are the best means to break fortified positions. And of course the Russians, in support of any offensive, would be able to deploy their aircraft with their bombs to break any Ukrainian defenses, any Ukrainian defense lines created east of the current Ukrainian defense line, which is, as I said, anchored in these four cities: Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Constantinovka, and Pokrovsk. Anyway, we shall see. I'm not absolutely certain that this line exists. It may be that the talk about it is mostly media speculation in Russia, I should say. I don't know whether it exists or not. I don't know how strong it will be if it is ever built. I don't know whether the Ukrainians have the means to defend it, but I've set out my own doubts. My own suspicion, for what it's worth, is that if Pokrovsk falls, and if Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Constantinovka fall soon after, because the Russians outflank them, then what will hold the Russians back, at least for a time, in a possible Russian advance further west, is not any new defense line that the Ukrainians might be creating east of the Dnieper, but the Dnieper itself. I think there is a high possibility that following the fall of this line of cities, the Ukrainians will finally do what many have been speculating they would do, which is retreat to the Dnieper itself and perhaps beyond it. Anyway, that's my guess. As I said, I'm no military expert, as I've pointed out many times. Maybe the Ukrainians have some other plan in mind. I'm not sure, though, what it is, but whatever. That, it seems to me, is the situation in Pokrovsk. There's less news about what's going on north of Pokrovsk. It could be, by the way, that the Russian advance north of Pokrovsk is partly in order to preempt any Ukrainian attempts to create new defense lines around Zaporoia. Maybe that is the case. I can't say. But anyway, that is the situation as I'm aware about it today in Pokrovsk. Now, there's been a lot more information from other parts of the battlefronts. The Russians supposedly have broken into Steppnosk, south of Zaporoia, the city of Zaporoia. Steppnosk was expected to be a hard nut for the Russians to capture. Again, I suspect that the reality is that not only are the Russians today far more skilled in capturing these places than they were, say, in 2022, 2023, when they made repeated unsuccessful attempts to capture the architecturally similar, though much smaller town, much bigger town, of Ugledar. But I suspect that the Ukrainians are weaker, that their forces defending Steppnosk are not of the same quality as the forces that they had defending Ugledar. So anyway, a Russian advance there. Now, it's perhaps worth saying that if Steppnosk were to fall to the Russians, that would bring the Russians still closer, within about 40 kilometers, I believe, of the city of Zaporoia. Perhaps just outside practical artillery range. There would maybe be some Russian large caliber guns, the 203 millimeter guns and those types of guns, which would have the range in that case to shell Zaporoia. But these guns, I expect, are in relatively short supply and would probably be needed for other things. Just saying. But anyway, it would bring the Russians closer to Zaporoia. And it's been pointed out by a number of people, a number of commentators, that the closer the Russians get to Zaporoia, even if they don't storm the city of Zaporoia, which is a big industrial city and a major military operation. Though it should be said, it is a big city, but then so was Mariupol. Zaporoia is bigger than Mariupol was, but it's same sort of order of magnitude. And the Russians were able ultimately to capture Mariupol and did so in about 2 months. So maybe Zaporoia might not be quite as big a challenge to capture as some people assume. But anyway, even if the Russians never were to capture Zaporoia and didn't try to do so, if they reach its outskirts, if they bring the city within artillery range, then presumably they would be in a position to interfere with the transportation of goods. That means tanks and machines and artillery and reinforcements, which move from Zaporoia across the Dnieper to the east, to the front lines. And that, of course, doesn't even address the underlying enigma of the Dnieper bridges. There are such bridges in Zaporoia, so I believe. Perhaps one day the Russians will attack them too, in which case, of course, all ferrying of supplies across the Dnieper would stop. But anyway, I'm not going to rehearse that long, tangled discussion that we've seen. Now, there's other fighting going on in other places. There's intense fighting going on in Constantinovka. I spoke yesterday about how it looks as if the two garrisons, the Ukrainian garrisons in Katerinovka and Kliban-Bik, two villages to the south of Constantinovka, are now basically trapped. Redovka had quite a lot to say about that too. It said that the Ukrainian soldiers holding these two villages have essentially been abandoned by the Ukrainian command. It is more important for the Ukrainian command that they resist than they are rescued. Of course, to say immediately, that is a Russian interpretation. Maybe Redovka is arguing too far there. But again, it may be otherwise. One could see the argument that the Ukrainians need to shore up their defenses in Constantinovka, and keeping the Russians bogged down for several days or even weeks, trying to reduce these two villages of Katerinovka and Kliban-Bik, which have been bombed out of existence, buys the Ukrainians time. Well, anyway, so a lot of that is going on. There have been more reports of further Russian advances in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region. The Russians claim to be capturing the old buildings in Yunakovka, in Sumy region. The battle for Yunakovka has again proved very long, and it's clear to me that the Russians never committed enough men to capture Yunakovka quickly, which is an interesting fact in itself, and one which begs questions which I don't intend to divert myself into a discussion of in this program. And there are further reports that the Russians are indeed now finally closing in on Liman and Siversk, west of Slavyansk, with street fighting continuing in Kupiansk, which is indeed apparently mostly encircled. But anyway, that's my brief summary of the situation on the battlefronts. Last night, there was another big missile and drone strike across Ukraine. We're going to have to wait and see what the Russian Ministry of Defense tells us the targets were. The Ukrainians always claim large numbers of drones and missiles were intercepted and shot down. The evidence from the ground strongly argues the opposite, but there just isn't enough information for the moment for me to come to any definite conclusions about what this missile strike and drone attack was about, other than that it continues to speak of constant Russian activity in the sky, the Russians continuing to hammer Ukraine from the sky. I did read in one channel that one particular target was the big Ukrainian airbase at Constantinovka in west central Ukraine. This was, by the way, a major airbase built by the Soviet Union. Large groups of tactical bombers, Sukhoi 24 bombers, were stationed there during the later stages of the Cold War. Just saying. Now, of course, it is used by Ukraine. And there are reports, to be more precise, that the major target that the Russians were aiming for in Starokonstantinov was not the Ukrainian aircraft that still operate from that base, F-16s and perhaps a few Sukhoi 24s, but principally Patriot air defense missile battery that is supposedly located there. Well, those were just, again, reports. We'll have to see whether or not they're true. Whilst I'm on this topic, a few days ago, a number of Romanian civilians filmed a Ukrainian Sukhoi 27 fighter jet entering Romanian airspace. And there's been a lot of speculation about what that is about. The Romanian authorities, as I understand, are saying very little about this incident. And the implication was that this aircraft strayed into Romanian airspace rather than entering it intentionally. But inevitably, it has reawakened rumours, which of course I cannot confirm, that the Ukrainian fighter jet, the Sukhoi 27, is in fact actually operating from air bases inside Romania itself, and that this has been an arrangement that the Ukrainians and the Romanians, and of course NATO, Romania is a NATO country, reached some time ago. Let me stress, these are again rumours, stories. They may be completely untrue. There may be no possible way to verify. There is no possible way at the moment to verify or corroborate them. They're perfectly plausible, and for that reason I report them, but I don't know that there is any factual basis for them. Anyway, one thing one can say with confidence, a Ukrainian reporter from the Kiev Independent recently visited Pakovsk. When I say recently visited Pakovsk, I think this happened about a week ago from the report that he has filed and of which a video exists. He spoke about the fact that this would be his last visit to Pakovsk, and it's clear that he saw the situation for the Ukrainian defenders in Pakovsk deteriorating fast. I found it actually a difficult video to watch, just saying. it seemed to be preparing the ground for an eventual admission that Pokrovsk is indeed going to be lost. I think this is going to be a major battle in the war, a major event in the war. There is another piece of commentary that also makes me think that Pokrovsk soon is likely to fall. And this is an article that has appeared in Reuters about Ukraine's supposedly successful defense of Pokrovsk in 2024. Supposedly, after the fall of Avdiivka, the Russian army advanced westwards, and its major objective then was Pokrovsk, and the Russians supposedly launched various attempts to capture Pokrovsk in 2024, but the Ukrainians were able successfully to repel all those attacks. That is the Reuters article. However, Reuters says that the Russians have changed and adapted their tactics. They've now introduced fiber optic drones. Despite enormous losses, there's always this commentary in every Western media outlet about the enormous losses that the Russians supposedly are enduring. Anyway, despite enormous losses, the Russians are now finally making progress in Pokrovsk. And there's the usual interviews with Ukrainian soldiers that basically give credence to this story of a successful defense of Pokrovsk in 2024 and in the first few weeks and months of this year, but of a situation where basically overwhelming weight of numbers is now beginning to tell, and that the Russians are gradually, ever so gradually, gaining control of Pokrovsk. Now, I have to say straight away that I don't recognize this account of what happened in Pokrovsk in 2024 from my own close observation of the battle at that time. I too, in the high summer of 2024, assumed, as everybody did, that Pokrovsk was in fact the major Russian objective. It's important to say, however, that the Russians never said that it was. No Russian official or military officer ever spoke of Pokrovsk as the objective. And again, my clear impression from 2024 is that though the Russians did capture various places like Pishanye and Kotlino, south and southwest of Pokrovsk, Shevchenko, and all these important villages, this is clearly intended more as a launch pad for further advances this year, and also to shield what was last year the principal Russian advance, which took place further south. And in fact, further south, a whole important sequence of towns, Novogrodivka, Selidovo, Kurakhovo, Ugleda, fell one after the other, a fact which the Reuters article doesn't mention or comment upon, and it seems to me that that was clearly the major Russian priority last year. These towns, Selidovo in particular, as I discussed in my program yesterday, are the launch pad now for the Russian attack on Pokrovsk from the south. So anyway, that's my overall take. I treat this Reuters article as an admission that the situation in Pokrovsk is becoming critical, just as the Daily Telegraph was persuaded to publish a whole series of articles about the successful defense of Toetsk, basically after its fall. So I think Reuters is now publishing a piece about the successful defense of Pokrovsk as it is about to fall. Anyway, that's the situation on the front lines, on the battlefronts. Now, Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, whom I very much regard as a friend, and whose commentary, I think, about the war has been exemplary, has recently made, in a number of places, what I consider to be a very astute point. He said that what has actually happened over the last few weeks is that with President Trump's recent criticisms of President Putin of Russia, his comments about how Putin speaks very nicely to Trump, very politely to Trump over the phone, but never makes the concessions that Trump expects. Those criticisms of Putin by Trump, Trump's further comments about the fact that he is going to continue to supply weapons to Ukraine, though via the Europeans, the fact that Trump has also threatened Russia with sanctions and secondary sanctions unless the Russians sign a deal with the Ukrainians by the beginning of September. By doing all of those things, perhaps without understanding what he has done, Trump has actually doomed Ukraine. The reason is that Trump has again thrown to Zelensky and the people around him a lifeline of hope. The idea that if they can just go on holding out for just a little longer, the Americans are now so angry with the Russians, Trump is so angry with the Russians, that Trump and the United States will ride to Ukraine's rescue. And this deterred Ukraine from engaging the Russians in serious negotiations over the last few weeks. Instead of realizing that the situation on the front lines was becoming catastrophic and that concessions needed to be made, the Ukrainians instead, Zelensky and Yermak and the officials around them, thought that if they dug in their heels, the Americans would impose these massive sanctions and that would bring the Russians to heel and that would save Ukraine. So that the result of all of this is that, in fact, Ukraine has been led further down the garden path towards its own destruction. Now, I say all of that. I was reading yesterday a long piece on the blog of another former British diplomat who goes by the name of Aurélien. I have no contact with him. He's a very thoughtful, almost philosophical writer. And of course, he also brings up the long, tantalizing question of how do the Russians achieve what they would describe as a victory in Ukraine if the Western powers, the Europeans and the Ukrainians, don't recognize it. So even if the Ukrainian army collapses, as, say, the German army basically collapsed in the spring of 1945, if the Ukrainian army collapses, what do the Russians do? I mean, they would like to create perhaps a puppet government in Kiev that would sign a deal with them. But what if that government never achieves legitimacy? What if the West refuses to recognize it? What if resistance at some level in Ukraine continues? All of these are good questions, but they don't help Ukraine in its current situation. And for the record, my own personal view is that considering the long, centuries-old interconnection between Russia and Ukraine that exists, if there is the kind of defeat of Ukraine, which is now just over the time horizon, then that will create facts in Ukraine itself that will ease the Russians' problems. Putin recently made an observation that however far west Russia goes, it's still Russian territory because Ukraine, as he put it, is ours. Now, as I said at the time, I didn't think this was intended to be a particularly confrontational or belligerent statement, but it does, I think, reflect a Russian belief that ultimately, if Russia does gain control of territories in Ukraine, including territories beyond the historic Russian-speaking territories in the east, because of the long history between Russia and Ukraine and the intense similarity of the people, they will be Russian forever. Well, again, the Russians may be wrong about that, but I, for one, would be nervous of assuming that they would be. Now, over the last couple of days, the Turkish Foreign Minister, Mr. Fidan, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and President Zelensky himself have all been busy floating ideas about a summit meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Now, the Russians don't seem to be keen on this idea at all, and in fact, they have actually today spoken out against it. This is from Peskov, and that's Putin's spokesman. In our opinion, work at the expert level should be done first, because it is completely illogical to leave this difficult preliminary work, to the president. First, it is necessary to get ready, put together settlement process parameters, and then record them at the top level, but not the other way round. And Peskov said this after being asked by journalists to comment on Erdogan's statement that he's ready to organize a meeting between Putin and Trump in Istanbul. And then Putin, Trump, and Zelensky, I should say, in Istanbul. And then this report, which is, by the way, on Interfax, says that the journalists also asked Peskov to comment on Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan's remarks that Moscow and Kiev have reached a tentative agreement that a possible future meeting between the Russian and Ukrainian presidents could take place in Turkey. And then Peskov said, certainly all parties to the negotiation process like Turkey, and of course, I speak for our side here, we are grateful to Ankara and the leadership of Turkey for their efforts to help search for settlement options for the conditions provided by the Turkish leadership for conducing negotiations. And this attitude of ours certainly stays for the future. So, to me, again, that looks like a polite no. So, no meeting between Trump and Putin in Istanbul or in Turkey. The grounds for that have not been prepared. We are very far away from reaching any agreement on this and on the what Peskov calls the structure of the settlement process parameters. And as for Fidan's comment about an imminent summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky in Turkey, well, Peskov is politely saying, well, we're very grateful for all the hard work that the Turks are doing and for their hospitality and the way in which they organize and arrange these meetings. But, well, for the moment, no thank you very much. So that's what it looks like to me. And I get the impression that the Russians have just used the last 24 hours again to repeat what is in fact their very strong positions. So Peskov has commented about the outcome of the last Istanbul meeting, the one that took place last week. He was asked whether the Ukrainians have come back to the Russian proposal to create 3 working groups as part of the settlement process, and Peskov replied, no, there is no understanding on this matter. We are waiting, and but the Russians have no real sense that the Ukrainians are really even addressing that idea. And, well, there's also been very strong statements, a succession of very, very strong statements over the last couple of days, of last couple of hours, from none other than the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. So first of all, he says that the conflict in Ukraine is another Western attempt to crush Russia. He spoke in implacable terms about this. He said, for the first time in history, Russia is fighting against the entire West alone. We've got a lot on our plate. Our main task is to defeat the enemy. For this first time in history, we are fighting alone against the entire West. During World War I and II, we had allies. Now we have no allies on the battlefield, so we must rely on ourselves, and there is no room for weakness. He did, by the way, on the question of Russia having no allies on the battlefield, say elsewhere, later in his comments, that Russia is in fact grateful for the North Koreans who fought alongside the Russians in Kursk region. Anyway, Lavrov then went on to say that the West demands Russia immediately cease fire and leaves things where they are in order to give a respite, his words, to Ukraine to allow it to be rearmed. I think with each passing day we can see that the Europeans really want to inflict a defeat on us. Western elites don't hide their readiness to kill Russian soldiers, which European elites are almost taking for granted. He then spoke very strongly about the revival of a certain ideology from the 1930s in Ukraine itself, and then he went on to discuss what the Russians see as the parameters for a peace settlement in Ukraine. Russia's conditions for resolving the conflict with Ukraine include an end to attempts to drag Kiev into NATO and expand the alliance, as well as the need to recognize the realities on the ground. We insist on what is our legitimate demand, that is on ensuring our security. There should be no dragging Ukraine into NATO and no NATO expansion at all. The bloc has already expanded close to our borders, despite the promises that were made and the documents that were approved. And finally, the realities enshrined in our constitution need to be recognized. It's a crucial demand. So that's Lavrov. So the Russians, as far as I can see, making no concessions whatsoever, trashing the idea of a Putin-Zelensky summit, slow walking the idea of a Putin-Trump summit. We go back to what Lavrov said, that the priority is victory on the battlefield. It is winning the war. Now we have no allies on the battlefield, so we must rely on ourselves. There is no room for weakness. Our main task is to defeat the enemy. Implacable language. And as I said, I see no sign of any wavering from it on the part of anyone at this time in Moscow. I see no sign that the Russians are interested in a Minsk III or a frozen conflict or any of those things, or that they've been intimidated by Trump's sanctions threats, or that their allies, the Chinese and the others, are wavering in response to those sanctions and tariff threats. So that is the reality. And going back to what Ian Proud said, I think it's one that the Ukrainians, perhaps heeding the latest messages from Trump, and by the way from Europe also, perhaps let themselves be seduced from listening properly to. Anyway, there we go. That is the state of the war. That is the state of the negotiations, or more precisely, the lack of negotiations, both between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and the West at this current time. The Russians, by the way, just for the record, have also said some very harsh things about the French president, Emmanuel Macron. So Lavrov was speaking also about him. Lavrov said that Russia's open to dialogue with any country, including European nations. And then listen to what he said about Macron. When President Macron called our president, he means Putin, immediately picked up the phone. I won't disclose the details of their communication, but frankly, there were minimal effects from it, particularly because later President Macron began making public statements about the need to put pressure on Russia to force it into an unconditional ceasefire. And Lavrov then went on to point out that it wasn't the first time the French president had made such remarks. When he first made such a statement and was asked if Paris will stop sending weapons to Ukraine, he said no, because it should be an unconditional ceasefire. So there it is. The Russians basically saying that Macron's call to Putin, which took place on the 1st of this month, has turned out to have been, again, another complete waste of time. Now, all of this deteriorating situation in Ukraine is taking place even as the Europeans have, by almost universal agreement, botched the negotiations on tariffs with the Americans. Now, I've been reading various commentaries here, and there is almost universal agreement that the deal that Ursula von der Leyen agreed with Donald Trump in Scotland was a disaster for Europe. It has been criticised, even as I make this program, by Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, and a notable, some would say even extreme Russian hardliner. It's been criticized by Lavrov. Well, you'd expect the Russians, maybe, to be rude about it. It's been criticized in France by Marine Le Pen. It's been criticized by the French Prime Minister, Monsieur Bayrou. It's been criticized by the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who has said that Trump had Ursula von der Leyen for lunch. It's been criticised by the Financial Times and in London, and by the economic commentator Matthew Lynn in the Daily Telegraph. A European measure that unites so many people of extremely diverging views, to put it mildly, in criticism, in effectively the same criticism, is obviously a European measure which is unusually, shall we say, unpopular. Now here I will express my own personal view, and that is that this agreement further knocks the nail into the coffin of European industry. From what I can understand, the United States has agreed to reduce tariffs against the EU from 30% to 15%. Virtually everybody expected the 30% tariffs from Trump was a negotiating pitch. It's been widely assumed for a while that his actual objective was to get from the Europeans 15% tariffs. 15% tariffs will cover the export of motor vehicles, passenger motor vehicles from Europe to the United States. United States having been a major market for exports of European passenger vehicles. There are some exceptions to this 15% tariff. One of them involves steel. There is a great deal of ambiguity and uncertainty as to what the position is with steel, European steel exports to the United States. The Financial Times says that steel exports will be subjected to quotas, which means in effect that the Europeans have agreed that they will reduce their exports of steel to the United States. The New York Times goes further, however, and says that steel exports, European steel exports to the United States, will continue to be subject to the current 50% tariff. I believe the New York Times. I see no reason, I've seen no document or statement from any party that suggests that that tariff has been withdrawn or relaxed in any way. So what do the Europeans get from this? Well, they're going to continue to receive at the market price oil and liquefied natural gas from the United States. In fact, they have no option because they've cut themselves off and are seemingly even more determined to cut themselves off from oil and gas supplied by Russia. Ursula von der Leyen, who was standing next to Donald Trump as he announced what the agreement would be, actually went and confirmed that in fact the European Union is going to end all imports of oil and gas from Russia and is going to look to the United States to make up the difference. Of course, the United States itself is a heavy user of oil and gas. President Trump's energy policy appears to be focused mostly on development of fossil fuels, oil and gas in other words. He also perhaps realizes, or perhaps he doesn't realize, but all of us should do, that according to the consensus in the industry, the shale revolution in the United States has now run its course, and that from now, oil and gas production in the United States is going to start to decline. And I would say that given the structure of the oil and gas, of the shale gas industry, I, for one, would not be surprised if that decline in production was rapid. In which case, the Europeans are no longer able to import cheaper oil and gas from Russia. They're going to be obliged to import oil and gas from the United States, where before long it might soon start to be in short supply. That will inevitably mean still higher energy prices in Europe. And of course, given that we're talking about the United States, which entirely understandably always prioritizes the interests of its own industries, it could be that the United States will start in a few years' time placing restrictions on exports of oil and gas to Europe. After all, it is not so long since the United States did apply an export ban, I believe on gas products, maybe on oil as well. So, strange strange agreement. I would add that Europe at the moment is involved in a quarrel with the Emir of Qatar, another major producer of liquefied natural gas. He's annoyed by some of the regulations that the Europeans want him to follow. He is now threatening to stop all exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe. I suppose and expect that this will be resolved over the next few weeks. So maybe this is only a momentary event. But anyway, it does still seem to me a rather strange thing to do, to be putting all one's eggs in the American basket and deny oneself access to the Russian basket, and at the same time to be catapulting oneself into quarrels with, of all people, the other big natural gas supplier, the Emir of Qatar. And of course all of this directly after the Europeans have also had a very unsuccessful meeting in China with Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership, in which they also found the Chinese leadership in an implacable mood on trade questions, again, mostly because of the way in which the Europeans themselves have damaged their entire relationship with China, their once very lucrative and very successful relationship with China. So anyway, this is what the Europeans have done. They've imposed tariffs on themselves, on their industries, on their agricultural producers. Probably some agricultural goods will get through to the United States. I can't imagine that rich Americans are going to deny themselves champagne and claret from France, for example, or Roquefort cheese and that kind of thing. But of course, the prices of these things will rise, and I suspect that increasingly we're going to see pressure even on exports of products like that. It's not, after all, as if the United States doesn't make very fine wines and cheeses of its own nowadays. Maybe not up to the level of those of France, but still very good. And what I just said anyway would be controversial with some of the producers in Napa region in California and elsewhere. So, agricultural producers, industry producers, manufacturers, notice that the EU is not imposing any reciprocal tariffs on the United States at all. So the Americans, benefiting from far lower energy costs, are going to be able to export, say, passenger vehicles to Europe. But the Europeans, struggling with very high energy costs, now facing problems with tariffs, which are going to raise the price of their goods even further, are going to struggle to export their goods, their manufactured goods, their cars and such things, to the United States. In addition, of course, the Europeans are committed to buying weapons from the United States, weapons from Ukraine, and the latest deals do exactly that which I was predicting a couple of programs ago. I said that this deal that had been done between NATO and Merz and Trump, that the United States would sell weapons to NATO, bought basically by Germany, which would then re-export those weapons for free to Ukraine. Anyway, I pointed out that inevitably this mechanism would be expanded so that the United States would be supplying weapons for the German army, the Bundeswehr, which would no longer arm itself from local industries to anything like the degree that Friedrich Merz was saying, and that this would ultimately undercut and weaken Germany's own fragmented and rather struggling military industrial industries. Well, it looks like that is going to happen too. I believe that hundreds of billions of dollars of arms purchases are now being talked about. I even saw a figure of $700 billion somewhere. And of course, the Europeans are also expected to invest money in the United States. Again, figures of $600 billion of European investments into the United States are being talked about. Though again, I'm completely unaware of what kind of a mechanism is being discussed and talked about to do this. Now, Donald Trump, as part of the various trade negotiations he's been conducting, he has been pushing hard, or basically extorting, large transfers of money from various trading partners of the United States. He recently announced that Japan, for example, had agreed to transfer hundreds of billions of dollars in investment funding into the United States. However, in the hours after Donald Trump said that, the Japanese authorities appeared to contradict him. They said that they were not aware of any such agreement having been reached. This was simply Trump saying that, and that Japan had made no such commitments, and that there is no written document in existence which sets out any conditions of that kind. So maybe the same will be true about these transfers from Europe. But the problem, and what distinguishes the Europeans from the Japanese, is that the Japanese and the Americans have clearly been in contact with each other. They've had discussions. The Japanese are pushing back on things the Americans say that they have agreed, or Trump says that they have agreed. There is room, therefore, to argue the point. But in the European case, Ursula von der Leyen was there with Donald Trump, and she appeared to be in agreement with everything he was proposing. I have to say that it really is dismaying to see this. I read, I think it was in the Financial Times, a comment by a CEO of a European company saying that he was ashamed of being European in light of this capitulation that we have just seen. There is some speculation that various European parliaments, which presumably would have to ratify whatever deal is cobbled together, will reject it. The problem is, and this is the key point to make, that as far as I can tell, an individual in some respects far more powerful than Ursula von der Leyen, has basically given the green light to all of this. And that person is the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz. Now, Merz, like Starmer, like all of the others, should, in my opinion, be focused overwhelmingly on one topic. Germany has been going through 3 years of recession. The German economy has contracted for 3 years in a row. That contraction is continuing. It is not a deep recession. It's quite shallow for the moment, but deindustrialization processes in Germany are accelerating. And before long, that's going to hit tax revenue. It's going to demand additional expenditure. What is holding up Germany at the moment is that the German government is spending money, which it is borrowing to do. It has some fiscal space to do it, but this cannot last indefinitely. One would have thought that that would be Friedrich Merz's priority. And given that this is so, and given that Germany is by far the biggest economy within the EU, I believe it accounts for something like 40% of the EU's GDP, and perhaps an even bigger share of its manufacturing. One would have thought that Merz, from the moment that he became Chancellor, would be traveling repeatedly to the United States, would be meeting with Donald Trump, would be talking to US officials, would be doing everything he possibly could to try to get a better deal for Germany and, of course, for Europe, because any deal, any trade deal that Germany now makes has to be done through the European Union. Merz did nothing. He did nothing like that. He has had meetings with Trump, but so far as I can tell, most of these meetings have been primarily about that issue which really interests him, which is Ukraine and Russia. First and foremost, Russia. He did suggest at one point to the Commission that the Commission tried to negotiate better deals for car manufacturers, but the Commission pushed back on that. They said it wouldn't work with Trump, and Merz accepted it. He didn't step in, conduct the negotiations himself, push Ursula von der Leyen to one side, which, by the way, he could have perfectly well done. Angela Merkel, in her day, would probably not have hesitated. Just saying. But no, he was not doing anything of that kind at all. Instead, as I said, he continues to talk about conflict with Russia. He's busy now sorting out plans to buy Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States and the Typhoon cruise missile launch system. I did a whole program about it. Much of that program was about it about a week ago, talking about what a massive system this is. I don't believe at the moment that the Americans have agreed that this system should be supplied to Ukraine, but looking at the pictures of it, it's enormous and enormously complicated and very heavy, and I would guess that it would require a huge amount of work and money to get it into operation. But anyway, never mind. That is the kind of priority that Merz has. Defending Germany and Europe from the aggressive, predatory threat of revanchist Russia. This is what he talks about. This is what he harps on about. This is his overriding concern. Not that different from Keir Starmer, actually. Or indeed, dare I say it, President Macron, who does have other ideas, but as we have seen from Lavrov, when he telephoned Putin, he had nothing much new to offer, and whatever he said that might have led to the Russians thinking of Macron as a possible interlocutor, Macron has predictably destroyed by saying all sorts of aggressive things which the Russians didn't like a few days later. Now, I said in my program yesterday that it requires exceptional diplomatic skill, or if you prefer, because I'm being ironic there, let me be more precise, exceptional incompetence to be on bad terms with all three of the world's superpowers at once: China, Russia, and the United States. The European leadership has achieved it. It requires extraordinary incompetence to wreck or unbalance the trade relationship with all three global superpowers at one and the same time: Russia, China, and the United States. But the European leadership has achieved it. They've achieved it because they continue to be fixated with Russia. They also continue to be obsessed with the United States and the importance of keeping the United States committed to Europe, the defense of Europe, as they like to say. So they make ever more outlandish and bizarre concessions in order to do that, there was a facetious comment in one of the British newspapers that Trump got everything that he wanted and must be very pleased by the result. Perhaps the one thing he didn't get was the Mona Lisa itself. Though I have to say, given the extent of this capitulation, if Trump had asked for the Mona Lisa, the Parthenon marbles, the treasures of the Uffizi, Michelangelo's David, well, who knows? Maybe they'd have given him those too. It is beyond belief, and it emphasizes again both the disastrous course that Europe is following, and I have to say this, the disastrous effect of all of the European states being tied down to the European Union and therefore following the lead of people like Ursula and Merz, who have one single-minded obsession, which is Russia. You could see that in the way that Ursula was talking about the fact that Europe is going to receive expensive oil and gas from the United States, which for all I know may be soon in short supply, as a good thing, because it means that Europe won't be getting cheaper oil and gas from Russia, which is a bad thing. Well, anyway, there it is. Obsessions always, in my experience, lead to bad outcomes. But because Ursula and Merz are united on this, even if they don't like each other, and because of the structure of the European Union, which is what it is, the people of Europe continue to be passengers on this train, which, as I said yesterday, is accelerating as it prepares to run off the cliff. Well, anyway, there it is. I'm not going to spend more time discussing this shambles. Shambles is what it is. I do not see how European industry is going to be able to function or export effectively, given the enormously high costs of production across Europe because of the super high energy costs, given the sacrifice of two of its key markets, Russia, and now, because of tariffs, the much bigger market, which was the United States, and given the way in which Europe seems intent on wrecking its once successful trade relationship with China. Europe is hurtling towards economic decay and irrelevance, and I don't see anything that can cause it to change course. Anyway, I will finish this program by returning to the topic of the decision by Zelensky to shut down or try to shut down Zaporoia and NABU, the two anti-corruption agencies. Now, it's been pointed out by various people that, in fact, these agencies have not, in fact, been especially successful. In fact, I read somewhere that NABU, in particular, has essentially failed in its various attempts to prosecute important people for corruption. It has never successfully been used in that way. And I've expressed my own deep skepticism that Zelensky's so-called reversal on this decision really means all that it appears to mean. I personally doubt that Zelensky really intends to bring NABU and Zaporoia back to the position that it formerly had. But it's now becoming increasingly clear to me that there is indeed a reaction within Ukraine from Zelensky's own supporters, his most loyal supporters, about his apparent reversal. It may not actually be very substantive, but they are extremely unhappy that they were led to vote for a law that subordinated Nabu and Sapor to the prosecutor's office. And now they are being blamed for that law and are being asked, in effect, to change it in a way that might reverse it. Now, Strana, the Ukrainian website, has interviewed one of Zelensky's people, and he had this to say: the consequences of the rollback are absolutely clear. A collapse in the manageability of the entire system, a wave of Nabu criminal cases against the president's inner circle, and the effective loss of control over the situation in the country by the office of the president. I think that's overstated. All of that is overstated, by the way, but anyway, that's what he said. But the main question is why? Why did Zelensky make any concessions at all? Because Poroshenko brought a few thousand Zoomers with cardboard boxes, cardboard signs into the street. That's what this parliamentarian is saying. Because the Europeans are concerned, because Starmer and Macron called. And what do we get from their concern? Does anyone seriously believe that Europe would have cut off funding and stopped arms supplies, dooming Ukraine to defeat in the war just because Nabu had some of its powers taken away? I personally don't believe that. It's unimaginable. And notice Trump and the State Department are silent. Why? Because Nabu is a project of the Democrats. All Nabu's actions and those of its support group against Zelensky and his office are part of a plan that was developed back during the Biden administration. And now this system is like a headless horseman. Trump has already chopped off the head in Washington, but the body, the global USAID, keeps moving in a predetermined direction, using its influence on Western media, EU structures, the anti-corruption vertical, and its support group in Ukraine. But the head is gone. So everything happening now is just a psychological attack, and I don't understand why Zelensky decided to back down. Now, that was said by one of Zelensky's MPs. Now, ultimately, all of this is about the war. All of this is about the defeats on the battle lines, the growing disillusionment with hope that Europe will be able to turn the tide, or that the United States will supply enough weapons to turn the tide. I've already said that, in my opinion, the reason why Zelensky changed course was because the Europeans threatened to withhold funding, and I doubt that this change of course is going to be for real. But you get a sense from this comment by this Ukrainian MP, who, to repeat again, Strana, which I consider a very reliable site, says is a supporter of Zelensky's, how fragile this person believes the situation in Ukraine is. The fear of Zelensky and of his inner circle that they might lose control. The worry that if they show weakness, they will not be able to cling on to control of Ukraine, even as the collapse that is now accelerating plays out. And their dismay that in this situation, when it was above all vital for Zelensky to show strength, he has appeared instead to make concessions to his opponents. Well, I still don't believe that this is going to change anything in practice. I still believe that Zelensky is in control. The security forces, as I said, seem to be loyal to him. I've seen multiple reports now which suggest that though there are different opinions in the army and in the nationalist brigades about these protests, by far the predominant opinion is hostility to these protests rather than support for them. Exasperation that these young middle-class people are protesting in Kiev about Nabu and Sapor and not about the mismanagement of the war, and that they're not joining the military to fight as well. There's all those undercurrents of feeling in Ukraine. So I don't myself believe that we're on the brink of a political crisis, though I could be wrong. But one can see the sense of fatigue and disillusion spread as the situation on the battlefronts deteriorates. Now, when Pokrovsk falls, maybe in the next couple of weeks, I suspect that the fear, the anger, the panic in Kiev, and even more the panic in Europe, and probably amongst some people in the United States, is going to, as I said, be on a scale such as we have never seen before. What happens then? Well, we'll have to see, but this is where I finish my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.